Lena Voss sold the draft horses on a Thursday, which meant by Friday morning most of Millhaven knew, and by Saturday the knowing had acquired the particular texture it gets when a community has decided something is both sad and inevitable. She sold them to a buyer from the Eastern Valley who came with a truck and a fair price, which she had negotiated by post over 2 weeks, because she was not going to be caught uninformed about what the animals were worth. She stood in the yard and watched them loaded, and did not perform anything for the men present. And when the buyer handed her the envelope, she put it in her coat pocket without counting it in front of him. She knew what was in it. She had known the figure for 2 weeks. The farm had been her husband's father's, and before that his grandfather's, and Daniel had died in March of a thing that had started in his chest and moved quickly, and she had spent the 4 months since March learning the exact shape of what she had been left with. It was not a bad shape, all things considered. The land was good, the buildings were sound. The debt was manageable if the operation ran at full capacity, and the operation had not run at full capacity since the previous July, when Daniel first could not get out of bed on his own. She had kept the accounts herself through all of it, because she had always kept the accounts, and she knew what the numbers said and she knew what they required. And one of the things they required was selling the draft horses, because she could not run the team and manage the rest by herself, and she was not willing to take on a hired man until she understood what she could afford to take on. She was 34 years old. She had been in Millhaven for 9 years, long enough that the town knew her by her married name and her work ethic and her bread at the fall social, but not long enough that the people who had grown up here had stopped considering her an arrival. She understood this and did not mind it and worked around it, the way you work around the furniture arrangement in a house you have been given, rather than chosen. The man at the fence when the horses were loaded was her neighbor, which she was aware of, and which she did not take as license for conversation. His name was Edward Cole. His farm abutted hers on the western side, 310 acres to her 160, and he had been her neighbor for 9 years without being anything more than that, which was a word she used in its most accurate and limited sense. They had exchanged the necessary courtesies over 9 years. The nod at the feed store, the brief conversation about the drainage ditch that ran along the shared fence line, the condolence card he had left on her porch in March, which had said, "I am sorry for the loss of Daniel," and nothing else, and which she had found respectful precisely because of what it did not try to do. He was at the fence when the buyer's truck pulled out, because his fence line ran past the point where the farm road met the county road, and he had been checking his western wire, which she could see had genuinely needed checking. He looked at the truck. He looked at her. He said he was sorry about the horses. She said the price was fair. He said he knew the buyer, that the animals would go to a good operation. She said she had checked his references before agreeing. He looked at the fence post. Then he looked at her again. He said if she needed a team for the spring planting, his had capacity for one more field. He said it the way he said everything, flatly, without ornament, the information delivered at its actual weight and no more. She said she would think about it. He went back to the wire. She went back inside. She thought about it for 2 days, which was the correct amount of time to think about an offer that was practical, and also something else she was not yet prepared to name. She went back to his fence line on a Sunday afternoon and said she would take the offer for the spring planting and that she would pay the going rate for team use. And he said the going rate was not necessary, and she said it was to her, and he looked at her for a moment and said, "All right." That was the arrangement. Spring planting was 6 weeks out, and she had 6 weeks of other work to fill, and she filled them the way she had filled every week since March, with the particular diligence of a woman who understands that stopping is not an option and has made her peace with that understanding. She was up before light and in bed after dark, and in between she ran the farm. At the level it could be run by one person with 2 hired half-days a week, which was the level she could afford until the spring accounts came in. She was not managing heroically. She was managing accurately, which is a different thing and requires a different kind of steadiness. Accuracy meant she knew what the fence on the south pasture would need before winter and had priced the materials and written it into the spring account as a projected cost. It meant she kept the equipment log the way Daniel had kept it, each service entry dated and noted, because equipment that is known is equipment that does not fail without warning. It meant she went to the feed store on Tuesdays and paid what was owed, and did not run a tab she could not clear at the end of the month, which was a discipline the feed merchant had noted, in the way feed merchants note such things without comment. She crossed paths with Edward Cole at the feed store on the second Tuesday of February. He was at the counter when she came in, and he looked up and said good morning, and she said good morning, and they both went about their errands, without making anything more of it, and that was the nature of the arrangement between neighbors who are not yet anything else, and she understood it, and was comfortable in it, and did not think about whether that comfort was the whole story. Millhaven had its opinions about her situation, and she received them the way she received weather, as information about conditions, not as instruction. She had been to the church social in April and sat with the women she knew, and eaten what was on her plate, and answered what was asked without making more of the evening than it was. She had been to the county extension meeting and spoken about the drainage plan she was considering for the low south field, and been listened to with the careful attention of people deciding whether she was going to be all right, which was the attendance level a woman in her situation could expect, and which she had prepared for. She was not short with anyone. She was precise, which some people read as short and others read correctly. A woman named Grace Hollis came by in the fourth week with a covered dish and the kind of concern that comes wrapped in questions about the future, specifically whether Lana had considered what the farm would look like in 5 years with no children and no man, and the debt service eating into the margin every season. Grace said these things with genuine care, which made them harder to answer than they would have been otherwise, because genuine care deserves honest engagement, and dishonest dismissal is a kind of rudeness Lena would not practice. She said she had considered it, and that she had plans for the margin, and that she appreciated the concern. Grace looked at the covered dish she had brought. She looked at the kitchen. She said, "You know Edward Cole is a good man." Lena set 2 plates on the table and said she would like to hear more about the casserole. Grace's mouth moved once. She sat down. She talked about the casserole. The spring planting went the way spring planting goes when the team is right and the soil has been properly prepared, which it had been because Lena had spent the previous fall turning the fields herself with the equipment she still had before the ground froze. Edward Cole brought the team on a Monday morning and worked the first field himself. while she worked the second with her own equipment, and they came together at the fence line at noon, and she had coffee in the thermos, and he had nothing, and she poured 2 cups without asking, and they drank them standing at the fence in the cold April air. He looked at her fields. He said the preparation was good. She said she had done it herself in October. He nodded and handed back the cup. He went back to the team, and she went back to her equipment, and they finished by late afternoon. And by the time the last row was turned, the light was going, and the fields had that particular smell of fresh worked ground. That is one of the better smells a person can stand in and breathe. She stood at the edge of the last field for a moment. He was unhitching the team at the far end. He did not call over to her. She watched him work the harness in the way she had found herself, watching him work on the 2 days he had been on her land, not with any specific attention, but with the general attention of someone noting the quality of a thing. The same way you note a well-hung gate or a properly set post. He moved through the unhitching without wasted motion and without the particular self-consciousness of a man who knows he is being observed, because he was not, as far as he knew, being observed, and this was itself a kind of information. She went inside and started supper, and left a plate covered on the counter for herself, because she was not hungry yet, and she sat at the kitchen table with the account book and let the numbers say what they said, which was that the spring was looking better than the fall had suggested it would. She wrote 3 entries and then looked at the lamp for a while, and then wrote 3 more. And the evening came on around the kitchen, and the account book said what it said, and she let it say it, and did not reach for anything it had not offered. But she turned to the page where the team use was logged. The going rate she had paid him, entered correctly in both columns, and she held her pen over it for a moment before closing the book and going to bed. The Tuesday after the planting, a man named Porter came by. He was a land agent who worked the Western Valley, and he had been circling the Voss farm since April in the way of someone waiting for a woman's resolve to thin. He had made one offer in April, shortly after Daniel died, and she had refused it, and he had said he understood, and he had waited what he apparently considered a respectful interval and come back. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and the patient expression of a man who has decided that patience is the same as inevitability, and he said the farm was a considerable undertaking for a single woman, and that his buyer was still interested, and that the offer was still available at the same figure. She said the figure was not what the land was worth, and she said she had comparable sales from the county office to support that, and she said it plainly without heat. He said comparable sales accounted for going operations, and that hers was not currently a going operation at full capacity. She said it was going at the capacity she had set for it, and that the spring planting was in, and the accounts were current, and the debt service was on schedule. He looked at the planting behind her. He looked at the team standing at the far end of the property, where Edward Cole had brought them back to help with the second field. Porter looked at the team. He looked at her. He said, "I see." He put his hat on. He said if the situation changed, she knew how to reach him. She said she did. He left, and the sound of his wagon on the county road faded, and she stood in the yard for a moment, and then she walked to the fence line. Edward was unhitching at the far end. She had not asked him to bring the team a second day. He had brought it because the work had required it, and he had seen that. She stood at the fence and looked at that for a moment, not at the work itself, but at the quality of the decision that had produced it, which was the same quality she had been observing for 6 weeks without quite looking at it directly. He came up to the fence when he saw her standing there. She said Porter had been by. He said he knew Porter. She said the offer was below value. He said Porter's offers were always below value, which was how Porter operated. He said it the way you say something that is simply a known quantity, useful information rather than reassurance. Then he looked at the fence post and then at her and said, "The offer is going to keep coming until the operation looks too solid to argue with." She said she was aware of that. He said, "It will look solid by fall if the summer holds." She looked at the fields behind him. She said she knew that. They stood at the fence in the late afternoon with the team standing patient at the far end and the planting in behind them both and the western sky, doing what western skies do in April, which is put more color into the last hour than the whole rest of the day. Neither of them said anything further. The western sky had deepened while they were talking, and the light was going from orange to flat, and the team at the far end of the field was standing with the particular patience of animals who understand they are waiting and do not mind it. She was aware of the distance between herself and this man at the fence, which was the distance of a fence line, and she was aware that it was a shorter distance than it had been in March. And she held both of these things the way she held the account figures, accurately, without conclusion, waiting for the season to show her what they meant. After a while, she went back inside and he went back to his team, and she stood at the kitchen window and watched him go, and then looked at the fields and let the day settle around her. The account book was on the table where she had left it, and she sat down and opened it, and the spring figures said what she had worked for them to say, and outside the last light went out of the western sky, and the farm went quiet around the house, and she stayed at the table long after the lamp was the only light left. The pivot came on an evening in June, after a day that had been long in the good way, the hay cut and the baler running clean and the rows coming up straight, and she had been at the kitchen table after supper with the account book and a cup of tea that had gone cold when she heard the particular knock at the back door that she had learned to recognize as his. She had learned it because he had come by several times since the planting, once to look at a piece of her equipment that had been running rough, and once to return a gate latch she had left on the shared fence line, and once on no reason she could identify, except that he had knocked and said he was passing, and asked if the baler was giving trouble, and she had said it had been, and he had looked at it and found the adjustment and shown her the adjustment and left. She had noted each visit in the way she noted everything, accurately, without amplifying it into something it had not declared itself to be, and without dismissing it either, because dismissing accurate information was a habit she had never been able to afford. He came in when she opened it and stood in the kitchen the way he stood in all rooms, taking up only what the space required. He said he had been thinking about the fall and the debt service and the question of whether the farm could run at full capacity by the following spring. She said she had been thinking about the same. He said he thought it could. She said she thought so too. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the account book on the table. He looked at her. He said there was a faster way to make the operation look solid, and that it was not a complicated idea, and that he had been thinking about whether to say it for several weeks, and that he was going to say it now because not saying it was starting to cost him more than saying it would. He said, "I would like to combine the operations." He said, "Mine and yours, run together permanently." He said, "As husband and wife, if you want that." He said the last part the way a man says something he has earned the right to say by everything that preceded it, without apology and without decoration. He had his hands flat on the table and his eyes on her, and she looked at him and took the full space of the choosing. And the kitchen was quiet, and the account book was open, and the numbers in it said what she had worked for 4 months to make them say. And outside the June evening was going on without any interest in what happened next in the kitchen. She had not wanted little, she had wanted accurately, and the accurate want looked like this. A man who had checked his fence wire on the day she sold the horses and offered his team before she had thought to ask for it, and stood at the fence line in April with the patient attention of someone who has already made up his mind and is waiting for the situation to make up its own. She said yes. He closed his hands around hers on the table and held on for a moment, and then he sat down and she poured him a cup of tea from the pot that was still warm, and they sat at the kitchen table with the account book open between them and began to talk about the fall. They married in August on the farm, which was the right place. The accounts had been combined in July, and the combined operation had a shape that even Porter, when he drove past on his way to market in September, did not stop to argue with. He did not stop. The team that had come to her fields in April was in her barn now, and the fence line between the two properties had been taken down in the section along the shared paddock, the posts pulled, and the wire rolled and set aside, and where the fence had been there was now simply a continuation of the same ground. One of the pulled fence posts leaned against the barn wall where she had put it the morning after they took the line down. She had not decided what to do with it yet, and she found she was not in a hurry to decide, because there was something right about a post that had been a boundary becoming simply a piece of wood leaning against a barn wall, waiting to be made into something useful. She passed it each morning on her way to the barn in the early light, the dew still on the grass, and the valley fog sitting low in the fields. She passed it, and she noticed it, and she let it be what it was, which was a thing that had served its purpose and been set down. The mornings had that quality now, the quality of work that starts each day from the same place, with the same person, toward the same end. Edward was in the barn before her most mornings, which she had understood was simply his habit, and which she had not tried to correct, and she came in to the sound of him at the far end and the lamp already lit, and the team already watered, and she went to her side of the work, and they moved through the morning together with the economy of two people who have learned each other's rhythm so thoroughly they no longer have to think about it. The account book on the kitchen table had grown thicker. The debt service was running 3 months ahead of schedule. The fall harvest had come in the way it comes in, when the land is properly worked and the weather holds and the people managing it have been paying attention, which they had been, both of them, for longer than the summer. The following spring the Southfield drainage went in the way she had planned it in the winter, and the low corner that had stood wet for 2 seasons ran clear after the first hard rain, and she stood at the edge of it in the April mud and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing that has been correctly understood and correctly addressed. Edward was at the far end of the same field checking the new tile line, and he looked up and she looked at him across the length of it, and neither of them said anything, because the field said what needed to be said. On a morning in the second October, she came out of the barn to find him at the fence post, leaning against the barn wall. He had his hand on it, and he was looking at it with the expression of a man who has made up his mind about something. He looked at her when she came out. He said he thought it would make good fence for the north paddock, which was running short on posts. She looked at the post. She said that was a good use for it. He picked it up and carried it toward the north paddock, and she went back to the morning, and behind her, the wall where the post had leaned was bare in the early light, and the dew was on the grass, and the valley was doing what it did each morning, which was simply continue. And that was the story of Lena, who watched the last of what she had inherited disappear down a farm road in a buyer's truck, and found that what came after was more entirely hers than anything she had been given. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this one. Thank you.